Thank you all very much, and welcome tonight. Just a few brief words, and then we'll get on with the real show. I'd like to welcome you to the 2013 Authors Visiting in Des Moines series. This evening, Karen Thompson Walker will discuss and present her novel, The Age of Miracles. If you've not yet had the pleasure of reading it, I can tell you that you have a real treat in store. A review from the New York Times had this to say: her voice turns what might have been just a clever mashup of disaster epic with sensitive young adult coming-of-age story into a genuinely moving tale that mixes the real and the surreal, the ordinary and the extraordinary, with impressive fluency and flair. Publishers Weekly called it a gripping debut. While the apocalypse looms large, has in fact already arrived, the narrative remains fiercely grounded in the surreal and the horrifying day-to-day, and the personal decisions that persist even though no one knows what to do. A triumph of vision, language, and terrifying momentum, the story also feels eerily plausible, as if the problems we've been worrying about all along pale in comparison to what might actually bring our end. A New York Times bestseller, the book is also a finalist for the Barnes & Noble Discover Award, as well as for the Indie Choice Award and a Goodreads Choice Award. Named one of the best books of the year by People Magazine, O Magazine, the Financial Times, Kirkus, and Publishers Weekly, the book has been translated into 29 languages. According to Deadline, Karen's gripping story may well be adapted for an upcoming movie, with Catherine Hardwicke as the director. Karen is a graduate of UCLA and the Columbia MFA program, and previously worked as a book editor at Simon & Schuster. Her writing has appeared in the Wall Street Journal and Real Simple, and in 2012, Walker gave a TED Talk on the subject of fear and the imagination at the TED Global Conference in Edinburgh, Scotland. Born and raised in San Diego, she now lives in Iowa City, Iowa, with her husband. It is now my great pleasure to introduce to you the author of The Age of Miracles. Please join me in extending a warm Des Moines welcome to Karen Thompson Walker.
Thank you. Thanks so much for coming. It's such a great turnout. I'm really excited to be part of such a wonderful series. It's exciting, especially as a new-ish Iowa resident. The reason I'm in Iowa City is because my husband just started as a student this fall. I mean, I guess it's not that recent, 8 months ago, as a student at the Iowa Writers Workshop. So we're in Iowa for an exciting reason, but it's fun to kind of get a chance to explore the state. I mean, really, this is really one of my first, I've never lived in the Midwest, and I never even was able to visit very much. So it's really been kind of exciting and stimulating and great to get to know the area. And this is my first time in Des Moines. And what a beautiful building. I kind of can't get over how beautiful this library is. I also wanted to say before I sort of get started that really my favorite part of these kinds of things is always the questions at the end. So please, feel free to ask away if there's anything you might be interested in. And I like that part because then I get to find out what you definitely are interested in knowing. But I'll start. So The Age of Miracles is my first novel. It's the story of a young girl and her family who wake up one morning, along with the rest of the world, to this really extraordinary news and extraordinarily alarming news. And the news is that the rotation of the Earth has suddenly started to slow down. And a lot of times when people hear that premise, I find they ask me right away, where I got the idea for that. So that's where I'll start. And the idea actually came from something that really did happen. Back in 2004, or maybe early 2005, I read that the earthquake that caused that huge tsunami in Indonesia that year, that earthquake was so powerful that it actually affected the rotation of the planet. And so after that, our 24-hour days were a fraction of a second shorter. And when I heard that, I just, I couldn't believe it. I found it really stunning. And even though it was a very small change, it was kind of frightening to me that something I had always taken for granted, the steady and predictable rising and setting of the sun, the idea that even that is actually in flux was kind of, it was creepy and sort of horrifying to me. But at the same, and I started to wonder right away what would happen if a much, much larger change were to happen in the rotation of the Earth. So in the book, instead of the rotation of the Earth changing by a small amount and affecting the days by fractions of a second, in the book, the 24-hour day grows by hours. So first by about an hour, and then 2 hours, and then eventually the days are 30 hours and then 40 hours. And so it's sort of this novel is the story of this gradually unfolding global catastrophe. But it's also really a story about a young girl and what it's like to grow up in a time of extreme uncertainty. So as I kind of remember right where I was when I heard that detail about the rotation of the Earth, and I was in graduate school at the time, writing, for creative writing in New York at Columbia. And I was writing short stories at the time, so I decided to try writing a short story in which the rotation of the Earth changed dramatically. And if somehow I could have, someone told me that short story would have been my first novel, I would have been totally shocked, because it was kind of an experiment for me. I had before that only written pretty realistic stories, so to be working with this fantastical premise was really a new thing for me. And it was only 14 pages long, but it did have sort of the same voice and the same opening that the novel eventually came to have. And it always was going to be partly about this young girl, Julia. And that decision came to me sort of immediately and suddenly, and I didn't exactly think it through. That's just the way I could imagine telling this story. But I do think it helped. Focusing on a young girl did turn out to be a way to make this big global premise feel, I hope, more intimate and more personal, and in that sense, maybe more real. I kind of was interested in trying to tell a disaster story, a different kind of disaster story, that would really be focused on ordinary people and how they would react to this huge, to a huge catastrophe and sort of an ongoing uncertainty. So anyway, I wrote this story. It was 14 pages long, and then I really set it aside. I didn't do much with it. It was part of my thesis, which was like a collection of short stories that I turned in for my master's. But I wasn't sure that I was going to do anything else with it, and I was just continued to write other stories, and I started working in book publishing. Got a job as an editorial assistant at Simon & Schuster. And after I'd been working in that job for about a year, learning to work on other people's books, I looked back at this short story, and for some reason at that point, sort of suddenly, I realized that premise might work as a novel. And I kind of remember thinking that, not exactly that I thought I could write it exactly, it was more like I could imagine it existing, like a novel with this premise could be on my shelf. And I really didn't know if I would be able to do it. I had never tried to write a novel before. my short stories were pretty short. They weren't even long stories. But I decided to try it. But the only problem, or the bigger problem at that time, is that now I had this full-time job that was very demanding. And I think, like a lot of jobs, but it's definitely true of being an editor or you start as an editorial assistant, work your way up. But that whole editorial sort of journey involves you're expected to do a lot of work in your free time, because during the workday, you answer phones and meet with authors and write jacket copy and help work with the artists in-house to figure out what the cover should be. All that kind of stuff is what you do in the day. And then you do your reading and evaluating of manuscripts and editing, helping other people improve helping people whose books you are publishing to improve their books. You do all of that work in your free time. So it was really hard to find time to write. And now, when I think about it, I think it's I didn't think it was that funny then, but now it seems sort of funny to me that during this time when I had so little time, I wrote a book about there literally being more hours in the day. So I don't know if that was necessarily something subconscious was happening there. But the way that I wrote this book was in the mornings before work, you know. And luckily, I should say, I didn't, sometimes when I say that, people think I woke up at 3 a.m, which I want to just say that I did not have to do that, because luckily, one of the good things about the schedule of my job was that book publishing in New York tends to start late in the day. I'm not late, but late compared to a lot of other jobs. So, you know, 9:30, 10 o'clock is okay. So I didn't have to get up that much earlier. But, you know, so anyway, I spent about 45 minutes or an hour every morning, or most mornings. And so it really is a book that was written that way, sort of hour by hour, minute by minute. And it felt very slow as I was writing it. It took me about 4 years working that way. And, you know, I had friends from graduate school who were publishing books, and I started to feel like the train has left, and I'm never going to publish a book, or I'm never going to finish the book, much less publish it. But, you know, sort of slowly but surely I got to the end. And I think, in general, I now feel just really grateful that I had that experience as an editor, because I know that it made me a better writer. So even though sometimes I felt frustrated by that I didn't have more time to write, I know that, you know, all the lessons I had to learn to become an editor, you know, how to, what makes for, you know, a realistic character, what makes for the clearest kind of sentence, you know, what's a good sense of structure, and what does a reader want from a story, all those things that I had to learn as an editor, I certainly took home and tried to apply to my own book. And it was great. I mean, being a book editor is sort of like being a professional reader. You know, it's your job to stand in for the reader. And so I think I know it made me a better writer because it made me a better reader. And I think a big part of writing, probably nonfiction too, but definitely fiction, is being able to imagine a reader and what will be clear to that reader, and what will be boring, what will be exciting, what will be surprising, and that part of the imaginative process, I feel like, is just as important as the imagination it takes to you know, come up with the story. So I'm thankful that I had the chance to work as an editor. And then I sort of thought that whether I published this book or not, either way, I would continue to be an editor, and I would just hope that I could, you know, publish books and be an editor at the same time. But after, I don't know, probably 8 or 9 months after I sold my book, it just started to get a little too tempting to try to take the leap and try writing full time. So I don't know that I'll be doing it forever, but it's sort of has been a nice experiment so far, and allowed my husband to feel more you know, excited about applying to MFA programs and going to the Iowa Writers Workshop, because I think he probably would have felt like, oh no, I shouldn't take Karen away from her job. So anyway, so it worked out well. So I think I'm gonna just read a couple pages from the beginning to give you a sense of what the book is like, and then talk a little more about research. So I don't think it needs much setup. This is just the very first few pages. And the narrator is this woman, Julia, who it's very closely focused on the year when the slowing, as it's called, that's what they call this event, the year when the slowing began, and she was 11 years old then. So it's, you know, it's technically an adult narrator, but she's remembering in very close detail her childhood experiences. 1, we didn't notice right away. We couldn't feel it. We did not sense at first the extra time, bulging from the smooth edge of each day, like a tumor blooming beneath skin. We were distracted back then by weather and war. We had no interest in the turning of the earth. Bombs continued to explode on the streets of distant countries. Hurricanes came and went. Summer ended. A new school year began. The clocks ticked as usual. Seconds beaded into minutes. Minutes grew into hours. And there was nothing to suggest that those hours, too, were not still pooling into days, each the same fixed length known to every human being. But there were those who would later claim to have recognized the disaster before the rest of us did. These were the night workers, the graveyard shifters, the stalkers of shelves and the loaders of ships, the drivers of big rig trucks. Or else they were the bearers of different burdens, the sleepless and the troubled and the sick. These people were accustomed to waiting out the night. Through bloodshot eyes, a few did detect a certain persistence of darkness on the mornings leading up to the news, but each mistook it for the private misperception of a lonely, rattled mind. On the 6th of October, the experts went public. This, of course, is the day we all remember. There'd been a change, they said, a slowing, and that's what we called it from then on, the slowing. We have no way of knowing if this trend will continue, said a shy, bearded scientist at a hastily arranged press conference, now infamous. He cleared his throat and swallowed. Cameras flashed in his eyes. And then came the moment, replayed so often afterward, that the particular cadences of that scientist's speech, the dips and the pauses and that slight Midwestern slant, would be forever married to the news itself. He went on, but we suspect it will continue. Our days had grown by 56 minutes in the night. At the beginning, people stood on street corners and shouted about the end of the world. Counselors came to talk to us at school. I remember watching Mr. Valencia next door fill up his garage with stacks of canned food and bottled water, as if preparing, it now seems to me, for a disaster much more minor. The grocery stores were soon empty, the shelves sucked clean like chicken bones. The freeway clogged immediately. People heard the news and they wanted to move. Families piled into minivans and crossed state lines. They scurried in every direction, like small animals caught suddenly under a light. But of course, there was nowhere on earth to go. 2. The news broke on a Saturday. In our house, at least, the change had gone unnoticed. We were still asleep when the sun came up that morning, and so we sensed nothing unusual in the timing of its rise. Those last few hours before we learned of the slowing remained preserved in my memory, even all these years later, as if trapped behind glass. My friend Hannah had slept over the night before, and we had camped out in sleeping bags on the living room floor, where we'd slept side by side on 100 other nights. We woke to the purring of lawnmower motors and the barking of dogs, to the soft squeak of a trampoline as the twins jumped next door. In an hour, we'd both be dressed in blue soccer uniforms, hair pulled back, sunscreen applied, cleats clicking on tile. I had the weirdest dream last night, said Hannah. She lay on her stomach, her head propped up on one elbow, her long blonde hair hanging tangled behind her ears. She had a certain skinny beauty that I wished I had, too. You always have weird dreams, I said. She unzipped her sleeping bag and sat up, pressed her knees to her chest. From her slim wrist, there jingled a charm bracelet crowded with charms. Among them, one half of a small brass heart, the other half of which belonged to me. In the dream, she said, I was at my house, but it wasn't my house. I was with my mom, but she wasn't my mom. My sisters were not my sisters. I hardly ever remember my dreams, I said, and then I got up to let the cats out of the garage. My parents were spending that morning the way I remember them spending every morning, reading the newspaper at the dining room table. I can still see them sitting there, my mother in her green bathrobe, her hair wet, skimming quickly through the pages, while my father sat in silence, fully dressed, reading every story in the order it appeared, each one reflected in the thick lenses of his glasses. My father would save that day's paper for a long time afterward, packed away like an heirloom, folded neatly beside the newspaper from the day I was born. The pages of that Saturday's paper, printed before the news was out, report a rise in the city's real estate prices, the further erosion of several area beaches, and plans for a new freeway overpass. That week, a local surfer had been attacked by a great white shark. Border Patrol agents discovered a 3-mile-long drug-running tunnel 6 feet beneath the U.S.-Mexico border, and the body of a young girl, long missing, was found buried under a pile of white rocks in the wide, empty desert out east. The times of that day's sunrise and sunset appear in a chart on the back page, predictions that did not, of course, come to pass. Half an hour before we heard the news, my mother went out for bagels. I think the cats sensed the change before we did. They were both Siamese, but different breeds. Chloe was sleepy and feathery and sweet. Tony was her opposite, an old and anxious creature, possibly mentally ill, a cat who tore out his own fur in snatches and left it in piles around the house, tiny tumbleweeds set adrift on the carpet. In those last few minutes, as I ladled dry food into their bowls, the ears of both cats began to swivel wildly toward the front yard. Maybe they felt it somehow, a shift in the air. They both knew the sound of my mother's Volvo pulling into the driveway, but I wondered later if they recognized also the unusually quick spin of the wheels as she rushed to park the car, or the panic in the sharp crack of the parking brake as she yanked it into place. Soon even I could detect the pitch of my mother's mood from the stomps of her feet on the porch, the disorganized rattle of her keys against the door. She had heard those earliest news reports, now notorious, on the car radio between the bagel shop and home. "Turn on the TV right now," she said. She was breathless and sweaty. She left her keys in the teeth of the lock, where they would dangle all day. She went on, "Something god-awful is happening." So that's how it starts. The other question that I get a lot about this book is, do I have a background in science, and how much research did I do? And the answer is that I don't have a background in science. But I have always loved science as kind of a lay person. You know, I love the science section of the New York Times. I subscribe to Scientific American, and I used to subscribe to Discover, and I just love, especially the science stories that have this sort of element of wonder to them, you know. So my favorite kinds of stories are, you know, when scientists think they find a new planet that in some distant part of the universe that might be able to support life, or if they find a new species, like a weird new species that lives at the bottom of the ocean. Like those kinds of, you know, just sort of amazing science stories are something that I love. So I had that kind of interest, but I did not have like training or expertise. And so I did do a certain amount of research for this book because I really wanted it to feel real, you know. It's certainly fiction, but I wanted it to feel like it was really happening. And it was just as important to me to have the science feel real as it was to have the characters feel real. So I did research, but I did it mostly on my own. And the reason that well, some of it was sort of accidental, actually, and some of it was I did not so much require the scientists, but because some things I got just from reading the newspaper every day, you know, in our real world. You know, anytime I read a story about a mysterious extinction of species, or, you know, the way that people discuss and debate climate change and its effects and causes, you know, or even how people reacted to the global financial crisis, like all those things that were happening in our real world at the time that I was writing this book, I tried to learn from and sort of drop the relevant things into the book. Or, you know, like anything I read about, you know, a study about sleep or circadian rhythms, like those kinds of things that helped me imagine how people would sleep in this new world that I had created. So that was some of the research I did, but I also did specifically do research about, you know, what might happen to us, what would happen to the planet, what would happen to the plants and animals if the rotation of the Earth suddenly slowed down by a dramatic amount. And the good thing about the premise, and the fun thing about a premise like this, is that I knew, since this has never happened before, this degree of change, and no scientists are not expecting it to happen. Because of that, I felt a certain freedom, because, you know, no one, even scientists, knows for sure what would happen if this were to take place. And even though, you know, scientists could speculate on that and know, you know, there's a lot they do know about, I felt this sort of pocket of space for my imagination that I could imagine and own this scenario in a way that if I had chosen a different kind of disaster, I think I wouldn't have felt that same level of freedom. So that was one of the things that was fun about this book. But I did try to learn as much as I could about the science of it. But I did it on my own, like I said, and the reason I did that is partly because, I think it's partly because I worked in book publishing, which meant that I knew kind of painfully well how hard it is to publish a book. And so I just didn't want to bother a scientist when I knew that there was a good chance that my book would never leave my computer. So I don't know if that was just like a failure of nerve or or just like a type of humility, I'm not sure. But anyway, that's why I didn't contact a scientist earlier. But then when I sold it, then I sort of felt like, okay, now it really is going to be published. And now I really want to make sure, or at least I want to know if there's things in here that don't make any sense. I at least would like to be aware of that before it is mentioned, in a newspaper. But and it was also a chance, I would have a chance to correct things that I could. So I found through a colleague at work, through one of the other editors, I found an astrophysicist, who's a graduate student at Johns Hopkins in astrophysics, but he also happened to be a real lover of fiction. So he was the perfect reader for me because he was good at knowing, what I needed, what things, if I had misstated something that was from, known science, he could help me fix that. But he also was, it had sort of a generous and imaginative sense of what could happen, and kind of could embrace the unknown elements of this book, of this story. So he was great. And in general, I was relieved by how much of it he said he felt was based in real science, but he also really crucially helped me correct a few things that I had misunderstood. So I'm really glad that he read the book. And I guess I should say, when I say it was based in real science, it's sort of once you take the big leap that this thing that no one is expecting to happen, what if tomorrow we woke up and this was the news, the rotation of the Earth had slowed down. After that, the details, are mostly based in real science. So I was glad that he felt that way. But also I did correct a few things. And I did I took a few liberties. It still is fiction, but I really wanted it to feel as real as possible. And then I guess the one thing that I didn't have to do research about is the setting. So it's set in Southern California, where I grew up. I grew up in San Diego, sort of coastal San Diego. And initially, when I chose that setting for this book, it was just out of convenience, because I was writing a story about an 11-year-old girl, and the easiest thing seemed to be to set the story in the place where I had been an 11-year-old girl. And I think children I think, have a real kind of close relationship with the natural setting of a place, what kind of plants there are. I mean, especially like the feel of the plants, or the knowing what things smell like, or what the cut grass smells like, what the ocean smells like, what it feels to have, sand between your toes, and all that kind of sensory memory. For me, in California, my California memories were really strong, and so it was useful, and I tried to use as many of them as possible as I wrote this story. But the further I got into the book, I started to feel like maybe there was a more profound reason that I set it in California, and maybe even growing up in California was maybe part of how I ended up writing a story about a huge disaster. And I think that's because, California is a place where you're just very aware of the power of natural disaster from a very young age. And maybe even more than the actual natural disaster, the feeling of the threat of it. That was just part of growing up there. Like we did earthquake drills every year, and at the beginning of every school year, we had to pack a Ziploc bag full of non-perishable food. And that food, it was 3 days supply. That food would sit in like some sort of bin in the corner of the classroom, and that food was the food that, if the big one, the catastrophic earthquake that they think will someday hit California, if that happened and stranded us at school, we would eat that food. And when I think about it as an adult, it's so creepy. I don't think they went into a lot of detail, with the kids, but you knew what it was for. But anyway, those things were, normal. And another time that I especially remember was when I was about Julia's age. There were 2 earthquakes on the same day, and I remember having this. Well, one, it was just very scary. But certain experts, because of something about where these earthquakes were and the proximity to each other and in time, somebody said on TV that there was a 50% chance that the big one was going to happen in the next 24 hours. So I remember going to the grocery store with my mom, and that's what everyone did. Also, we got there, and it was just swarming with people, and to make sure, make sure we had the right earthquake supplies. And so the shelves where the bottled water was, or the batteries, or baby food, all that stuff was, almost cleared. And I remember really vividly seeing people's grocery carts like heaped full of supplies. And it was really scary, but then the big one, the 24 hours passed and nothing, and it was fine. But I do remember that really vividly, and I tried to sort of learn from that as I wrote a book about people facing a huge disaster. But I think the more I thought about it, maybe the most interesting thing about disaster and growing up in California, or living with that sense of disaster in California, is how often you don't think of the disasters. Most days in California are very pleasant, and you're not, even though you know that your life could change in an instant, you don't think that way, and you live as if that's not true. And I think there's something very California about that, but it's also just sort of human. We all live with uncertainty, and most days we manage to sort of live as if that's not true. And I definitely tried to think about that and remember that when I was writing this book, which is obviously about people facing an even bigger disaster. And I wanted it to be not just about how people panic, but also about all the ways that people manage to go on and live life and as normally as they can, and hold on to their rituals and their sense of the everyday. So I'm going to read one more shorter section. And this one, it takes place later in the book. And it's a scene with Julia and this boy named Seth. And Seth is someone who, after Julia's gone through this sort of long period of loneliness at school, she has finally bonded with this boy, Seth. And on this day, I should say, one of the strange effects of the slowing that they don't totally understand is that whales begin to beach themselves en masse. So on this day, Julia and this boy, Seth, go down to the beach near where they live to look at the whales. Seth knew a shortcut through the canyon to the beach. It was a steep and sandy trail littered with pine cones and shaded by limestone bluffs. The smell of the canyon was the same as ever, like soil and sage, but the colors of California were turning starker. All the greens were fading away. Most everything was dying. Still, the canyon buzzed with beetles and mosquitoes and flies. Whatever the birds had once eaten was flourishing, unhunted. "Watch out for snakes," said Seth. I liked the way he walked, loose and unhurried, a boy who knew his way. I was the girl walking with him, so I walked that way too. The trail swung around a corner, and the beach came into view. It was low tide, lower than I had ever seen it. The slowing was throwing off all the tides. Hundreds of feet of seafloor lay exposed, the sand ribboned black with bits of iron. These were the ocean's insides, revealed. We stopped on the trail for a moment, watching the ocean side by side, our hands so close they almost touched. We crossed the coast road, ducked beneath the caution tape, and cut through the space between two ruined mansions, wet from the last high tide. One house had collapsed like a cake. Its walls were lined with barnacles. Sea anemones carpeted the front steps. I bent to take off my shoes. "Look," said Seth. And there they were, the whales, dark and still, prehistoric in size. A small crowd of people had gathered on the beach. Good Samaritans were dumping salt water on the whales. Other volunteers were returning from the distant tide, swaying with buckets full of fresh seawater. We could hear the whales breathing, a slow rising and falling. We listened, we watched. They were social creatures, the whole group distressed by the stress of any one individual. It was obvious they were dying, but we couldn't help it. We were mesmerized. Seth picked up 2 empty plastic cups from the sand. They were bits of ancient litter. He handed one to me. "We have to do something," he said. "Come on." We ran barefoot down to the water, cups in hand. It was a long run. The mud sucked our feet. Creatures slithered unseen beneath my toes. Dead fish sparkled in the sun as my hair whipped in the wind. When we reached the lapping water and looked back, the humans on the beach were barely visible. Their hairline arms and hairline legs fluttered soundlessly around the whales. The only noise was the churning of the ocean. We rushed to fill our cups with water and then ran back across the thick band of mud. We looked for the driest whale, the one most in need. We found it at the edge of the group, and we imagined that it was older than the others. Its skin was striped white with scars. I shooed flies from its eyes, one eye at a time. Seth poured our meager water supply over its head and into its mouth. He petted its side. I felt an urgency, like love. "Hey, kids," someone called from behind us. It was a man in a beach hat, an empty white bucket swinging from one hand. A gust of wind drowned out what he said, so he shouted it again. "That one's already dead." We were solemn as we climbed back up through the canyon. We were hot and exhausted. It was the 23rd hour of daylight. The sun showed no signs of sinking. "It's the magnetic field that's doing it," said Seth. "What is?" A strong wind blew through the canyon, kicking up dust and dried leaves. "That's why the whales are beaching themselves. They use the magnetic field for navigation, and now it's decaying because of the slowing." I glanced at the sky, a smooth, unblemished blue. "You can't see it," Seth said. "It's invisible." Those were only the first of the whales. Hundreds more would soon wash ashore on the California coastline, then thousands, tens of thousands, more. Eventually, people stopped trying to save them. "It's not just the whales who need the magnetic field," said Seth, as we arrived at the edge of the canyon and took our first steps on paved ground. "We need it too," he said. "My dad says that all the humans would die without it." But that day, I could hardly hear him. My mind was elsewhere. I was a little bit in love. I had spent an entire afternoon with Seth Moreno. So that's just a later scene. And then I guess I just wanted to say one more thing about apocalyptic novels and disaster stories and maybe why some of us are so drawn to them. And then I would really looking forward to the questions. So it's something that I've thought about a lot because I've always loved these end-of-the-world stories, and it's weird to be kind of attracted to that kind of story, but I know I'm not the only one. I mean, I think lately especially there's a lot of them out there, you know, from the Hunger Games or the TV show The Walking Dead. I think there's a brand new Tom Cruise movie about an end-of-the-world scenario or end of life as we know it scenario. And I think the more I've thought about it, the more I started to think that maybe, I know it's true for me, and maybe this is part of why other people like these kinds of stories, is that there's sort of this secret pleasure or perverse pleasure to reading about a world in which ordinary life has fallen away. And I think because when you read something like that, where, you know, everything we're used to is disappearing, you know, the sun no longer rises and sets at the right time, maybe it has a way of making you appreciate how extraordinary our ordinary life really is. And I know I've had that experience with other apocalyptic stories, you know, like one of my favorite books is Blindness by Jose Saramago. And then that's a story about an epidemic, a mysterious epidemic of blindness in a city where everyone goes blind within a few weeks. And even more than the blindness, it's the fact that no one's prepared for this, and so certain things like garbage collection and police and firefighting, like everything that has been set up for people with sight can't be done, and so at least not the way that they have been doing it. So there's this sudden breakdown of everything we're used to in society, and there's this one. I mean, there's a lot of scenes that had this effect on me, but there's, you know, one scene where finally, after weeks, these people haven't been able to bathe, and then finally, because the water, nobody's tending to the water system, it's just chaos has descended. And there's this scene where they're able to sort of take a bath in rain. And I think the author says something like, it was the most glorious, you know, the most glorious thing that had ever happened in the history of the city or something. But I did sort of have that feeling like I can bathe, or I can see, you know, these things that most of us are really used to, at least in this part of the world, that we're really used to and we take for granted, suddenly seemed, I was sort of felt more appreciative of those things than I did before. And so if my book has that effect for even just even temporarily or for a minute, it makes people, think twice about, just how amazing all of our ordinary daily life things are, then, that would be sort of the most gratifying response I can imagine. So I know that's what draws me to these dark stories, that in a way, there's a strange uplift, even though a lot of the things that happen are really dark on the page. So I think I'm going to stop there, but I'm definitely looking forward to talking some more. And I think, thank you.
Thank you for that. Can everyone hear me? This is your opportunity now. If you have the cards in your booklet sheets, please write out your questions and wave them. We have people in the aisles that will collect them, and I would be happy to share them with Karen. And while we're waiting for that, I have a few of my own. From my bride, what happened to Seth? She fell in love with Seth. What happens in your mind? Where does Seth go from here?
Yeah.
Is there a reunion?
Can you hear me? Is that working?
Well, I don't want to give everything away, but it is a big part of the book. Julia and this boy Seth, and the just sort of bond between these two previously isolated kids. So yeah, it's an important part of the book, and I don't know, I'm trying to answer this in a way that is satisfying if you have read it, but doesn't give anything away if you haven't. I think what I guess I could say is that in general, I thought a lot about the idea of uncertainty and how much we don't know in our real life, but that definitely in this story especially, people they don't know the answers to a lot of the questions that they have, and so there's for sure an element of uncertainty, and even for me about what happens with Seth. When I was imagining this book, I really tried to imagine it just from Julia's perspective, which makes it so that I feel like I only know what she knows, and there's things that she doesn't know the answer to, and so neither do I.
First question from the audience then. Why is the book called The Age of Miracles? And what, if any, miracles have you experienced?
It's a good question. I got the idea for the title when I had only written about 40 pages of the novel. And the phrase, I thought of it, or it occurred to me as a title because I heard it in a Billie Holiday song that I really like. And it just, when I heard it, I like the phrase, but it also occurred to me that it might be the right title for this book because it has, I thought it would have, the word age would have a double meaning. The age that Julia is as a young girl going through adolescence, but also an age, like an era in the history of the earth. And then miracles, I definitely meant that in a little bit of a loose way and not the traditional religious way. I thought of it as a miracle, as an event that happens that breaks with the rules of reality as we understand them. So in that sense, I think the slowing, even though it has a lot of negative effects, it has that, it meets that definition of just sort of an awesome event that we can't explain. And in another way, I think adolescence, I put a line in the book about how adolescence is like an age of miracles because kids are changing and growing so quickly that it seems almost impossible. And there's a sense of, it's just amazing how much is going on in that phase of life, and there's something a little miraculous about that. Have I experienced any miracles? I don't know. That's a hard question. I probably not the big kind. When I was saying before about how I think apocalyptic stories can make you think more about how maybe miraculous just daily life is, I try to keep that in mind.
Many of you know we are tweeting tonight, and this question from Twitter, tell us about the movie.
the movie rights have been optioned to a company called River Road. They did The Tree of Life and Brokeback Mountain and a couple of other, good movies. So I'm really excited that they're working on trying to make it into a movie. And there's a script. And just a few weeks ago, we got some, exciting news, because I know that in Hollywood, it takes. You don't know if it's really going to be made into a movie until the day they're filming. So I try to just keep that in mind. But it's moving in the right direction. And the exciting news we just got a few weeks ago is that they got a director, Catherine Hardwicke, and she is most famous for doing Twilight, the first Twilight movie. So that was exciting. She also did a sort of artsy movie called 13. So I think maybe it'll be something in between those.
Very fun. The next question, at what point did you feel or know that your book was good enough to be published?
Oh, that's a hard question. I didn't know that it was good enough to be published. I mean, I think all I knew was that I had taken it to as far as I could get with it. I knew that I knew it had a certain completeness, like it didn't just. Well, it had a certain structure that went from beginning to middle to end. I knew there was some level like that, and I tried to make the sentences as polished as I could, but I didn't know if other people would think it was good enough. But I knew that I had sort of gotten to the end of what I could do myself, and I just hoped that maybe someone would think it was good enough. And then I did definitely do a lot of editing with my editor. We went a few rounds to make it better, but it's a hard thing to. I don't know if the author can ever know for sure that question, but it has always been helpful for me to think of taking a project like a story or a novel as far as I can on my own, and then before I get any outside feedback.
The ending, did you consider giving the novel a more definitive ending? And why did you end it the way you did?
I mean, the ending was definitely one of the hardest things to do. And I realized there was something in the design of the book that made it so the ending was always going to be really hard to figure out, which is I wanted this adult voice. I wanted the narrator to have access to an adult's perspective, but also dip deep into childhood. So I didn't want it, even though it was going to be a lot about childhood or adolescence, I didn't want it to be exclusively from the perspective of an adolescent, going through that in real time. So I liked the voice. But the only thing about that is if you're having an adult narrator talking about childhood, that means a certain amount of time has passed since the events described, obviously. But then if you're writing a story that might be about the end of the world, you can't just end it. I really wanted it to be focused on this year, like 1 year in the girl's life when the slowing started. But I mean, if I just had ended up and 6th grade graduation or 7th grade graduation was really sad that year, the end. Like you would be like, but what about the world? So I don't know. It was the trick of finding an ending had to do with figuring out how to account for that time lag between the events I really wanted to focus on and how we got to the point where she's an adult with his voice. So I struggled for a long time with it, and I was interested in it ending on a note with some uncertainty, because I think that's one of the sort of themes of the book, and also what I think is interesting about that feeling of uncertainty is that, of course, when you don't know what's going to happen, I mean, these characters don't know what's going to happen, and anytime we as people don't know what's going to happen next or in our future, it's scary, there's fear, but there's also hope. As long as you don't know for sure what's ahead, it allows for both of those emotions, and so I thought that maybe that would be the right way to end the book in a way that allowed for both emotions.
Perhaps there's a sequel. Perhaps maybe set in Iowa City, and instead of time slowing, it stands still.
Yeah, or speeds up.
Found it interesting, your discussions on your scientific research. This question is, what was the biggest scientific fact that you needed to change after your science expert reviewed your work?
Oh, that's a good question. The biggest thing, it wasn't really a big part of the story, but I was attached to it, and it was kind of exciting. And what it was is I had misunderstood, you know, if the rotation of the Earth changed, it would change by a slight amount our experience of gravity. But I thought that I misunderstood something that I had read. So I thought that gravity would be slightly less strong, so everything would be and it was a tiny bit, you know, like baseballs would fly a little bit further, or, you know, birds would fly a little faster, you know, that level of change. But when the scientist looked at it, he said also it would be a very small change, but it would actually be the exact opposite. So baseballs would fly a little less far. You know, we would all be pulled a little more strongly to the Earth. So for a minute, I remember when he pointed that out to me, I was like, I did have a temptation to think, but isn't that the great thing about writing fiction, that you can make, you know, the rules of the universe, even the rules of physics, you can just make them up. But I didn't. It sort of went against my sense of wanting to make sure that it felt as real as possible. So I reversed it, and actually, in the end, it didn't feel like as big of a change as. Like I found a way, because a lot of times in the book I used it more as, it was a real thing that was happening, but I would use it as sort of a metaphorical thing. You know, I would say kind of an as if it was making us feel freer, also, you know, that kind of stuff. So I found a way to say as if gravity was affecting our emotions and pulling us down more. You know, I was able to sort of reverse the metaphors, but it was initially a little bit painful, but I'm really glad that I switched it.
This writer asks to explain if symbolism was planned and significant. You read of the whales and Julia and Seth, and went to the one most in need. But it was already dead. What's the takeaway from this message?
You know, it's so interesting. I think I don't think a lot about symbols in my writing, and I remember, and I don't know, that I think probably other writers do it differently, but I think a lot of us don't think in that way. And I remember thinking, like, especially when I was in high school, and, you know, I probably thought I had more things figured out than I really did. But I remember feeling skeptical sometimes in my English classes when we were taught to say, like, see, this represents this and this represents this, and I was like, I don't know if I believe that the author, like, planted all those things in. But now that I have written a book, I realize that it's not important whether the author planted them in there, because they still can be there. Like, even that moment right there, like, because there's a lot of things that have been pointing out to me that I didn't think about consciously, but I think it just comes out because when you're writing something, you get obsessed with these certain feelings and themes that you don't necessarily, or I didn't necessarily think about them as separate from the story, but my mind was kind of obsessing about certain things. And so, like that one that you mentioned there, I don't know the person who wrote it what they imagined it would mean, but the line, the one most in need, like, in a way, it's like Julia, it's a lot about how she's so lonely and on her own and stuff. So I don't know, all of a sudden I'm like, oh, I could imagine if I had purposely put those things in, I might have put something like that on purpose, but it wasn't on purpose. So I think there's something you just start to thinking about. When I was writing the book, I thought a lot about, you know, loneliness and what it's like to be a part and not be part of the community, and then how much it means when you are part of the community. And so all that thinking, I'm sure, went into the writing about the whales, even though I didn't do it on purpose exactly.
How much of you is in Julia?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. You know, Julia is not exactly me, but I definitely drew on the emotional memories of what it was like to be that age. And I gave Julia certain, you know, personality traits that I have, especially had when I was, you know, 11, 12 years old. Like, she's shy. I was shy like she is, and I was kind of a little more reserved than the other kids, and felt sort of like the other kids were growing up faster than I was. So I put all of that into Julia, and I was also an only child, but I made up all the events that happened to her. So I gave her a certain amount of my personality, but my childhood was a lot happier than hers turns out to be.
Well, You seem neither shy nor reserved, but is there a particular chapter or passage that you're most proud of, that perhaps you labored over for a while to make it just right? And on the flip side, is there a book editor part of you that would like to take another crack at a certain chapter or passage?
Oh, those are really good questions. I don't know. I mean, I do a lot of revising and editing as I write, so there's a lot of sentences and paragraphs that I really spent a lot of time adjusting by slight amounts over and over again as I was writing it. Maybe the thing I'm most attached to is still the opening, because it's the oldest, and it's sort of the whole thing grew out of that. I mean, I adjusted the opening, but especially say the first sort of paragraph or first few paragraphs, it was just establishing that feeling was sort of how I figured out what the whole rest of the book would feel like. So I'm sort of attached to that, I guess. But it's true that especially when I read, sometimes I have the urge to wish that I could still make little changes. And it's interesting how I was just reading, just tonight when I was reading, I realized there's a line in here that I wouldn't write now, which, just from events of this week, I wouldn't have written it, which is I wrote, hurricanes came and went, bombs exploded on the streets of distant countries. And as I was reading it, I was really distracted by that, because I meant that to be like, how that feeling of how there's always bad things happening in other countries, and that exact thing, I just wouldn't have written it. So just personally sort of, it feels dated, just that one line. So, obviously a terrible way.
This reader asks for a comparison. They felt that the book reminded them of the late, great planet Earth. Are you familiar with that book?
Oh, no.
Okay. He wonders if the foretelling of the planet's demise had occurred to you, if it's a comparison to what you've written. But since you're not familiar with it,
Yeah.
Are there any other books that perhaps you drew inspiration from in the process of developing this book?
Yeah, I'm curious. What is it, the late, great planet Earth?
Yes.
I'm curious about that, but no, I don't know it. There's definitely books, though, that inspired me. I mentioned already Blindness by Jose Saramago, The Road by Cormac McCarthy, which is, a real dystopian, dark book, but I loved it. And another one that also is really helpful to me and inspiring is The Virgin Suicides by Jeffrey Eugenides. And that one, I think that helped me figure out that I could write this book, because he had a way of showing, like, even though it has this dramatic premise of five sisters who all commit suicide, it has obviously a big drama element, but so much of the book is about ordinary suburban American experience, but yet it's really just mesmerizing and kind of sparkles in this way that I didn't realize. I thought before I read that book that my own ordinary American childhood, that was not that dramatic, that there wasn't much to sort of mine in terms of a book, but reading that one helped me see how, especially if I worked with this big premise, it was actually a way of writing about my memories of ordinary California life in a way that I hoped would, be interesting.
This reader is struck by the behavior of Julia and that of her friends as 11-year-olds, as tweens, perhaps. They seemed older. Perhaps this is the characters reminiscing. But have other readers found the children's behavior to be true for their ages?
A few people have thought that they seemed a little older. It's interesting, because a lot of when I was writing the book, I was sort of drawing on my own memories of childhood or adolescence, but I think I was drawing a certain amount on like high school, and I still felt like I was a kid. So anyway, it's interesting. A few people have mentioned that to me, and I'm not sure. And I also wondered if when I made the decision to make her to settle on 6th grade as opposed to like 7th grade, I also thought, well, because I thought maybe kids now would be a little older. So I don't know. I'm not totally committed in a way to how old she is, but it's been interesting to hear the response. I mean, this is a telling detail. Adults say that to me a lot, but recently I spoke to 8th graders, and she said like that Julia seemed too young. So that was maybe a little alarming, but anyway.
You have a following here in Des Moines. People are following you on Facebook, and they're reading about your appearances and your travels and your favorite books. Some of the things with your husband. Could you give us perhaps some how-to lessons regarding how to keep up with the minutiae of life? And also keeping open spaces in your mind, which allows you to write and create?
Yeah. I don't know. I think I need that advice a little bit. I mean, I try to remember that I wrote this book when I had a full-time job, and I felt like I had no time. So I try to remember that and try to stay disciplined. But it is hard. It's hard to combine, creativity with just all the ordinary sort of errands and stuff that you have to get done. For me, it's important to write in the morning. I mean, sometimes I write other times of the day, but the morning is always the best, and I think it's because I haven't had time to let all those hassles into my mind yet, or the outside world into my mind. But I was better at that when I had a full-time job, because I know when I was working, that hour in the morning was just incredibly precious, and I wasn't tempted to, go on Twitter or check my email. But now, if I pause a little bit in my writing, I'll think, well, I have the whole day. Like, I can take 20 minutes to read the New York Times or something, but that takes my mind, and I do sometimes, but then it takes my mind away from my own story. So I'm struggling with that still.
As we all are, I suspect.
Yeah.
This is always an interesting type of question. Is there a question you wish someone would ask, but they never have?
Oh. I mean, there's not one sort of on the tip of my tongue, but it's a good question. I don't know. I'm not sure. I mean, a lot of the questions people ask are sort of related to other questions that I've been asked before, and it's always kind of exciting. Like that one, actually, when I get something different. But then, in this case, I don't know. I'm unprepared for that.
Then we'll go on with the last one, and maybe this is a segue for your next visit. What's the subject of your next novel?
So I feel a little superstitious about saying very much about it, because it just feels a little fragile because I'm so early on in the process. But I think what I've been sort of saying is that it's another story about ordinary people facing a really extreme situation. But in this new book, it's a totally different type of situation. But I will say Iowa might make an appearance.
I think you'll find, and most will agree with me, that once you're in Iowa, you're in Iowa. And it won't leave you no matter where you end up. This has been a fascinating evening.
Oh, thank you. For me too.
Thank you for taking the time to join us tonight.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.